Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's late evening at a busy international airport in the United States. Your plane has just landed after 14 exhausting hours in the air. Your legs feel stiff from sitting too long. Your eyes burn from lack of sleep. All you want now is a shower, a quiet room, and a few hours of rest. But before any of that can happen, there is one final step between you and the outside world: the immigration line. You stand there slowly moving forward with dozens of other travelers, passport in one hand, phone in the other, replaying the long journey in your head. Eventually, your turn arrives. You step up to the counter. The officer takes your passport and begins asking routine questions in a calm, almost mechanical tone. Where are you coming from? How long are you staying? What is the purpose of your visit? You answer honestly, just like thousands of travelers do every day. Everything seems normal. Then the officer glances down at your hands and says something that instantly changes the atmosphere. Please unlock your phone and hand it to me. For a split second, your brain freezes. Your entire digital life is sitting inside that device. Conversations with family members, photos from years ago, messages you barely remember sending, maybe even private jokes shared with relatives or friends back home. You hesitate just slightly, not because you did anything wrong, but because the request feels deeply personal. Still, you don't want trouble. You don't want delays. So, you type your passcode, unlock the screen, and hand the phone over the counter. 3 seconds. That's all it took. 3 simple seconds while you unlock that device. And without realizing it, you may have just made one of the most expensive mistakes a traveler can make at a U.S. airport. Because in those 3 seconds, something incredibly small, something almost nobody thinks about, may have just opened the door to years of your private messages, photos, and data. A few hours later, some travelers walk out of the airport and continue their trip. Others find themselves sitting in a quiet secondary inspection room, wondering how a routine arrival suddenly turned into a serious immigration problem. And the difference between those two outcomes often comes down to details most people never learn before they fly. Hi, I'm Sophia, and in this video, we're going to talk about something that almost nobody explains clearly before people travel to the United States. What immigration officers are legally allowed to see on your phone at the airport, and the small mistakes that can turn a normal arrival into a major immigration issue. Every day, thousands of travelers arrive at American airports with valid visas, valid documents, and perfectly normal travel plans. Yet some of those travelers still end up facing long secondary inspections, canceled visas, or denied entry, simply because they didn't understand how border inspections actually work. The truth is that the legal rules at a border crossing are very different from the rules you experience inside the country. Many travelers assume the same protections they hear about in everyday life apply the same way when entering the United States. In reality, airports operate under a unique legal framework that gives border officers broad authority to inspect belongings, including electronic devices. And that's where things start to get complicated. In this video, we're going to break down 5 critical mistakes travelers make when interacting with immigration officers, especially when it comes to smartphones and messaging apps like WhatsApp. We're going to look at what official border policies say about searching electronic devices, what information officers are actually allowed to access, and why something as simple as how your phone is configured in the moment it's handed over can make a massive difference. We'll also talk about one of the most misunderstood issues travelers face: the difference between the rights of visa holders and the rights of permanent residents when they arrive at a U.S. port of entry. And of course, we'll come back to the question that started this entire story: the 3-second mistake that can quietly expose far more of your digital life than you ever intended. Because the most important time to understand these rules isn't when you're standing at the counter in front of an officer. It's before you ever board the plane. To understand why a simple phone unlock can suddenly become such a serious moment at the airport, you first need to understand one of the most misunderstood legal realities about entering the United States. Many travelers believe that the constitutional protections they hear about in everyday life apply exactly the same way at the border. You've probably heard of the Fourth Amendment, the rule that says government authorities generally cannot search your personal property without a warrant signed by a judge. Inside the country, that protection is powerful. Police officers can't simply stop you on the street, grab your phone, and start scrolling through your messages without legal justification. That idea is deeply rooted in American law and culture. But the moment you arrive at an international border crossing, the legal environment changes in a way that surprises many people. Airports, seaports, and land border crossings operate under what's known as the border search exception. Under this doctrine, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers are given much broader authority to inspect travelers and their belongings as part of the country's responsibility to control who and what enters its territory. That authority includes the ability to search luggage, documents, and in many cases, electronic devices without obtaining a warrant beforehand. In practical terms, that means the normal expectations travelers have about privacy don't always function the same way when you're standing at an immigration checkpoint. And this is where the first major mistake often happens. Some travelers believe the best response to a request for a phone search is to challenge the officer on constitutional grounds. They might say something like, "You need a warrant to look at my phone," or "You can't search my device without probable cause." While those statements may reflect how people understand their rights inside the country, saying them in the middle of a primary inspection booth almost never ends the conversation in your favor. From the officer's perspective, arguing legal theory during a routine inspection can quickly raise suspicion. Instead of a simple 2-minute interaction, the situation may escalate into something called secondary inspection, a much longer and more detailed examination, where officers take additional time to review documents, ask more questions, and sometimes examine electronic devices more closely. What began as a quick entry check can suddenly turn into hours of waiting and questioning simply because the interaction became confrontational. Understanding the border search framework doesn't mean travelers have no rights, but it does mean the rules operate differently than most people expect. And once you understand that difference, the next issue becomes far more important. Because even when travelers cooperate with a phone search, there is a small detail that can dramatically change what officers are able to see. This brings us directly to the moment we started with the 3 seconds that most travelers never think about. Imagine again that the officer asks you to unlock your phone and hand it over. You type your passcode or use facial recognition. The screen lights up and you pass the device across the counter. That interaction happens quickly, often automatically. But during those few seconds, there is one step that many people forget entirely: disconnecting the phone from the internet before handing it over. The reason this matters has to do with how modern smartphones store and retrieve information. Today, a large portion of what we think of as our phone data isn't actually stored entirely on the device itself. Photos, emails, messages, documents, and app content are often synchronized with remote servers through cloud services. Messaging platforms like WhatsApp, for example, may store backups or historical conversations in remote accounts linked to the phone. Photo libraries may automatically sync with cloud storage services. Email apps constantly refresh messages from servers around the world. Under internal policy guidelines governing electronic device searches, officers conducting a manual review are generally expected to focus on information that exists locally on the device. But here's the complication. If a phone is actively connected to cellular data or airport Wi-Fi, when an application is opened, the device may automatically begin retrieving additional information from remote servers. An inbox refreshes. A message archive loads. A photo album synchronizes. Within seconds, the device screen may display information that was not originally stored on the phone at all. From the traveler's perspective, it can feel like private data from years ago suddenly appears out of nowhere, and all of it becomes visible simply because the phone remained connected to the internet when it changed hands. This is why many experienced travelers follow a simple precaution, sometimes described as the 3-second rule. Before handing over a device, they quickly swipe down and activate airplane mode, which disables cellular connectivity and usually turns off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth as well. That step limits the device to the information physically stored on it at that moment, instead of allowing apps to continuously pull additional data from remote accounts. It takes only a few seconds, but it can significantly reduce how much information is immediately accessible on the device screen. The key point here is not confrontation or refusal. It's understanding how technology behaves in real time during an inspection. Because once a device is unlocked and connected to the internet, modern apps can begin revealing far more than most people ever intended to show. Now, let's talk about the app that shows up in these situations more than almost any other: WhatsApp. Many travelers feel completely comfortable handing over their phones because they believe their messages are protected. After all, WhatsApp is famous for something called end-to-end encryption. You've probably heard that phrase many times. It sounds like the ultimate shield for privacy, and in many ways, it is extremely effective, but only in a very specific context. Encryption protects messages while they are traveling across the internet from one device to another. It prevents outsiders from intercepting those messages while they move through networks and servers. In other words, while your message is being sent from your phone to your friend's phone, it's protected from being read by third parties in transit. But once that message arrives and appears on your screen, encryption has already done its job. At that point, the message exists in plain text on the device itself. Anyone physically holding the unlocked phone can read it exactly the same way you do. That means the moment a traveler unlocks their phone and hands it to an officer, encryption is no longer the protective barrier many people assume it is. The messages are simply sitting there on the screen, organized into conversations, sometimes stretching back months or even years. And here's another important point many travelers misunderstand. Officers conducting inspections are not only looking for evidence of criminal activity in the immigration context, they are often looking for something much simpler: indications that a traveler's stated purpose for entering the country may not match their real intentions. Immigration law places heavy importance on something called intent. When someone arrives at the border using a temporary visa, such as a tourist visa, they are expected to follow the conditions attached to that status. A visitor visa generally allows someone to come to the United States temporarily for tourism, family visits, or similar short-term purposes. What it does not allow is working in the United States without authorization or secretly planning to remain permanently. Because of this, officers sometimes review digital conversations looking for statements that contradict the explanation a traveler provides at the inspection booth. Imagine a traveler arriving on a short tourist visit who tells the officer they are staying for 2 weeks to see family and explore the country. But during a phone review, an earlier conversation appears in which that traveler asked a relative about helping find a job while visiting. Even if the message was casual, exaggerated, or misunderstood, it can raise questions about whether the traveler intends to follow the rules of their visa. The issue isn't always about proving a crime. Sometimes it's simply about determining whether the person is eligible to enter under the visa category they presented. This is why phones can become unexpectedly powerful pieces of evidence during border inspections. Photos, notes, travel plans, conversations with relatives, all of these digital fragments can paint a picture of someone's intentions. Most travelers never imagine their everyday chats could be interpreted that way. Yet in the context of immigration law, even ordinary conversations can suddenly take on much greater significance. This leads to another area where confusion is extremely common: the difference between the rights of visa holders and the rights of permanent residents when interacting with border officers. On the surface, both groups may appear similar when they arrive at the airport. They stand in the same immigration lines, present documents at the same counters, and answer the same initial questions. But legally, their situations are very different. Travelers entering the United States on temporary visas, such as tourist visas, student visas, or many work visas, are asking for permission to enter the country each time they arrive. That means the burden is largely on them to demonstrate that they are admissible and that they intend to follow the terms of their visa. Because entry is a request rather than a guaranteed right, refusing to cooperate with certain inspection procedures can sometimes lead officers to conclude they cannot verify the traveler's eligibility to enter. In those situations, the officer may determine that admission should be denied and that the visa should be canceled. For visa holders, that possibility makes interactions at the inspection counter particularly sensitive. Permanent residents, on the other hand, are in a fundamentally different position. Someone with lawful permanent resident status, commonly known as holding a green card, has already been granted the legal right to live in the United States. When permanent residents travel abroad and return, they are generally considered to be coming back to their home rather than requesting permission to enter as a visitor. Because of that status, the government cannot simply deny a returning permanent resident entry for declining to unlock a device during an inspection. However, that doesn't mean there are no consequences at all. If a permanent resident refuses to provide access to a phone, officers may choose to retain the device for further examination. In some situations, devices can be sent for more detailed analysis, and the traveler may receive a receipt while the device is held temporarily. So, while the permanent resident status itself isn't automatically lost because of that refusal, the interaction can still become complicated and inconvenient. What this creates is a difficult decision that many travelers never expect to face. On one side is personal privacy, the desire to keep private conversations and personal data from being examined. On the other side are the practical realities of crossing an international border where authorities have significant inspection powers. Understanding which category you fall into before you arrive at the airport can make a huge difference in how you choose to respond if that moment ever comes. At this point, you might be wondering what actually happens after a traveler hands over their phone. Do officers simply glance at the screen and give it back? Or can the inspection go much deeper than that? The answer depends on the type of search being conducted, because under current border procedures, there are generally two different levels of electronic device inspections. The first is commonly referred to as a basic search. This is the type of review most travelers imagine when they hear about phone checks at the airport. In a basic search, an officer manually looks through the device using the phone's own interface. They may scroll through photo galleries, glance at recent messages, open certain applications, or review visible files. The process is usually quick and performed directly on the device itself. Because border inspections operate under broader authority than searches inside the country, officers may conduct these kinds of basic reviews without needing to demonstrate a specific suspicion about the traveler. It can happen randomly, or simply because the officer decides further inspection is appropriate. But there is another level of device examination that operates very differently. This is often called an advanced search, and it is far more comprehensive. Instead of manually scrolling through the device, officers connect the phone to specialized forensic software designed to extract large amounts of data from the device's storage. These systems are capable of creating a detailed copy of the phone's internal memory. Depending on the device and the software being used, the extraction process may reveal far more information than what appears during a simple manual review. Deleted messages, previously removed photos, fragments of location history, application records, and system data may all be analyzed during a forensic examination. It is essentially a digital deep dive into the device's stored information. Because advanced searches are so intrusive, internal policy guidelines generally require a higher level of justification before this type of forensic extraction takes place. Officers are expected to identify what is known as reasonable suspicion that a law may have been violated, or that a national security concern may exist before escalating to this level of analysis. In other words, advanced searches are not meant to be purely random. Something during the inspection process typically raises a red flag that leads officers to believe a deeper look is necessary. And this is where many travelers unknowingly create problems for themselves, not through illegal activity, but through behavior that unintentionally triggers those suspicions in the first place. One of the most powerful signals officers rely on during inspections is behavioral consistency. When someone answers questions calmly and their explanation matches their documents and travel plans, the interaction usually remains straightforward. But when something doesn't quite align, the situation can escalate quickly. For example, imagine a traveler who says they are visiting for 2 weeks, but arrives with several large suitcases filled with items that suggest a much longer stay. The officer may start wondering whether the traveler's stated plans are accurate. Inconsistencies like that often prompt additional questioning and sometimes deeper searches of personal belongings, including electronic devices. Nervous behavior can also play a role. Airports are stressful environments, and it's completely normal for travelers to feel anxious during immigration inspections. However, extreme nervousness, trembling hands, constantly changing answers, avoiding eye contact, or providing conflicting explanations can sometimes raise concerns for officers trained to detect unusual patterns. Another situation that frequently attracts attention involves travelers who attempt to clear their phones completely before arriving. Some people believe that performing a factory reset on their device the night before a flight is the safest strategy because it removes all messages and files. But from an investigative perspective, an almost empty phone can look suspicious rather than reassuring. A device that appears brand new despite belonging to someone who travels frequently may lead officers to wonder whether data was intentionally erased just before arrival. That perception alone can create the reasonable suspicion needed to justify a more advanced examination. The irony is that the attempt to hide information may draw more attention than the original data ever would have. This is why experienced travelers often focus less on trying to erase every digital trace and more on maintaining consistency and composure during the inspection process. Clear answers, realistic travel plans, and calm behavior can help keep an interaction routine instead of turning it into an escalating investigation. In many ways, the most effective protection a traveler has during a border inspection is not a clever technical trick or a complicated legal argument. It's simply appearing exactly as they claim to be, someone entering the country for the legitimate purpose stated in their documents. By now, you can probably see that the biggest problems at airports rarely come from dramatic situations. Most of the time, they come from small misunderstandings, tiny details about technology, behavior, or immigration rules that travelers simply never learned before boarding their flight. That's why it helps to think about border inspections the same way you would think about preparing for any important process. You prepare before you arrive, not while it's happening. So, let's bring everything together into a simple preparation strategy you can follow before your next trip to the United States. The first step is taking a careful look at your digital footprint before you even leave for the airport. Smartphones contain years of conversations, photos, documents, and notes that were never intended to be examined in a legal context. If you are traveling on a temporary visa, it's worth reviewing your messages, emails, and files with one question in mind. Could anything here be misinterpreted as a plan to violate the conditions of your visa? Conversations about job opportunities, long-term relocation plans, or statements about staying permanently can sometimes create confusion if they appear during a border inspection. The goal isn't paranoia. It's awareness that ordinary conversations may be interpreted differently in an immigration setting. The second step involves how your apps are configured before you land. Many experienced travelers choose to log out of certain social media or messaging platforms before reaching the immigration checkpoint. Logging out doesn't erase data from your device, but it does add an additional authentication step before an app opens, which can limit how easily new information refreshes or loads if someone taps into the application. The third step brings us back to the moment we discussed earlier, the 3-second rule. If an officer asks you to unlock your device, take a brief moment before handing it over to activate airplane mode and disable wireless connections. That simple action limits the phone to the data stored locally on the device, instead of allowing apps to automatically retrieve additional information from online accounts. It's a small technical detail, but it can dramatically change how much information becomes immediately visible on the screen. The fourth step is understanding your legal status before you ever reach the inspection counter. If you are traveling on a temporary visa, the priority is usually demonstrating cooperation and credibility so officers can verify your eligibility to enter. If you are a lawful permanent resident returning home, the legal framework is different, and your options may also be different. Knowing which category you fall into helps you make informed decisions in the moment, rather than reacting under pressure. And the final step is something that sounds simple, but carries enormous weight during any inspection. Maintain composure. Clear answers, consistent travel plans, and calm behavior can keep an interaction routine rather than turning it into an escalating investigation. In many cases, how a traveler presents themselves matters just as much as the documents they carry. The most important lesson in all of this is that airport inspections operate under a unique set of rules that many people never encounter until they are standing directly in front of an immigration officer. By that point, the opportunity to prepare has already passed. Smartphones have become extensions of our lives, holding our conversations, our memories, our plans, and sometimes even our frustrations, written casually in messages to friends and family. But when you cross an international border, that same device can suddenly become a window through which authorities try to understand your intentions. Knowing how those inspections work doesn't mean assuming the worst about every airport interaction. Millions of travelers enter the United States every year without any problems at all. The key difference is that informed travelers understand the environment they are entering and take a few simple steps to protect themselves before the journey even begins. Because when you're standing at that counter after a long flight, exhausted and eager to leave the airport, that is not the moment you want to be learning about device searches, cloud data, or the legal differences between visa categories. Preparation always happens earlier, and sometimes preparation is as small as remembering 3 seconds, the few seconds it takes to change a simple setting on your phone before handing it over. Small decisions like that can determine how much of your digital life becomes visible in that moment. And when you think about everything our phones contain today, those few seconds suddenly become incredibly valuable.